I begin, and I will start sharing my screen. And that should be visible. Thank you. So the title of this talk should hopefully appear self-evident: to engage with museums as field areas for exploring the endowments of historicity and the methods of the archaeological scholarship. And I kind of fixed to archaeological scholarship because that's what I know best. The importance of being able to connect practices of gathering and interpreting information with those of curation has been demonstrated in the burgeoning museum studies. And as Mary Bouquet reminds us, the curatorial imperatives largely in the West, which has been largely in the West, to unpick the taken for granted status of museums as authoritative leisure time destinations, explored their potentials as intercultural arena of cultural production and consumption. Inevitably, museum studies builds upon the presence of museums as contact zones. This was first mooted by James Clifford, who emphasized the merit of reckoning with museums as places where we may unravel the politics of representation. The museums constitute and nurture relations of many kinds, and these are all kinds of museums, not only certain kinds. Those and these relations could be which entail knowledge production, community network, allow us to see the negotiations between the state and the public, and the mutations of many different kinds of historiographies, especially the colonialist and the nationalist. Now, very, very quickly, because I've got Clifford's quote out here, Clifford actually problematized the one-way relationship between museums and indigenous people in the United States using an experience he observed in the Portland Museum between staff and the Native American elders, ostensibly around the display of sacred objects. The museum staff wanted to talk about objects they wanted to display, and the Native people wanted to talk about history and contemporary issues. So not only did they have different viewpoints, they didn't even want to have the same conversation. What happened, though, was that the museum basement became the place where they all came together and had what sounds like two mutually unsatisfying conversations that were the first step to the road to better mutual understanding. The museum, therefore, becomes a contact zone, a space where different cultures come into contact and conflict, where competing dialogues are heard, and reciprocity replaces one-way transmission and translation. So I think that's the most important thing we need to think about when we actually engage with museums. The emerging disciplines of museum archaeology and museum anthropology in the 21st century documents the academic value of noting the practices of collections management and informs of the continual contextualization of things as they get sorted, stored, displayed, and circulated. These two disciplines demonstrate the diverse legacies of anthropological and archaeological fieldwork, and perhaps more importantly, they present the challenges of conveying the legacies meaningfully to a range of publics and stakeholders. A methodological shift which museum archaeology and museum anthropology has brought about is from the study of objects and collections as independent singular things to their studies with all things they generate. Prominently, field notes, archival materials, photographs, and photographic media. As Alice Stevenson also reminds us, she's written a lot on museum archaeology, studying assemblages of stored objects together with the associated documentation, including maps and correspondences that is accumulated around them, show the multifarious histories and relationships they carry. Now, this is important, I think, more for archaeology, where fieldwork is seen as the be-all and end-all of many kinds of evidence fashioning. So the emphasis here is towards an approach to collections that seeks to perform connections for considering the ways in which collections constitute new contexts for themselves. The new scholarship shows the need to interrogate and explore the practices of collections management for also gauging the ways in which anthropological and archaeological evidence is fashioned and gains recognition, and it directs us to revise our ideas about object biographies, namely that these do not end with objects entering museums for storage and upkeep. A long stint. Okay, somebody wants admission, is it? Why is this not moving? Okay, Johan, I'm going to stop this for 1 minute because it seems that this is, yeah, okay, for some reason. Yeah, for some reason it wasn't. So a long stint of working with photograph collections at MAA, which is the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at Cambridge, brought me to regard histories of collections, objects, museums, archives, and such repositories, and also of the visual fashioning of materiality. Photographs, after all, allow us to see the ways in which material realities are made by directing the eye to what is to be seen. And they also show us that objects perform differently in different instances of viewing and how profoundly different narratives can be produced from the same thing. So what you see here is actually a couple of photographs of a boy. He's a Moanane boy, taken by somebody called Thomas Whiffen. He inserted the image of the boy within, which you see as a lantern slide, within actually a dancing, an illustration of a dancing of the Moanane group. And he suggested that this boy was the son of a chief. And he also said that the Moanane group did not domesticate dogs. Now you can see in the print, in the silver gelatin print, the boy is holding a dog. You can also see in the half-plate glass negative how the subject has been highlighted. And the photograph was actually taken, this is 1904, in a rubber plantation, which was deeply exploitative and cruel towards the natives. It says very little about really the identity of the boy. We really don't know whose son he is. And it says very little also about the different kinds of people who are there. So, I mean, you can see that there are people wearing Western clothes. I mean, so obviously, how they have got this person to photograph with the rest is not known. So, but as histories of encounter, photographs always have coaxed us to regard the legacies of their embodied materiality. They present the propensity of things, as you can see through these three, to carry many meanings. And as objects of encounter, they also talk in terms of, or they show us that we can control how things are to be seen. Photographs therefore tell us that our attributions of values to things shall always be contingent and direct us to interrogate our descriptions of things, the ways in which we classify, the ways in which we fix meanings, and the conservation work, which often brings about changes within an object. Notably, histories of the visual prompt us to regard the shifts and transformations through time of notions of evidence and of evidence making. Okay, I really honestly don't know why it's, I have to go back to change the slide again, but we'll just bear with me. So coming to fieldwork, fieldwork allows us to see that the immaterial is usually recalled through things. And a study of the wrapping and unwrapping of mummies in ancient Egypt and the 19th and 20th century West by Christina Riggs conveys the many ways in which the channeling between the material and immaterial world is accomplished through physical means and actions. This study builds upon diverse histories and ethnographies, such as of the development of Egyptology, the performance of science, mortuary practices in ancient Egypt, collecting the Orient in the West, and they in turn allow us to explore negotiated relationships between objects and people, past and present, myth-making and truth-making, concealing and revealing. Importantly, the study also documents the imbrication of ethical issues within acts of classification, whether you classify something as a corpse or as an object. And we're reminded to keep a critical eye at the ways in which objects are labeled and which historiographies or stories or histories are told about them, what truths are hidden about them. Squarely through the material linen and its materiality, Riggs also navigates diverse possibilities of connected histories, including the mummy collecting operations of the textile magnates of Manchester, which to a considerable extent fashion practices towards a scientific Egyptology in the UK, and also schemes of money making for these merchants, which involve transactions in Egyptian linen, which was actually produced in the UK. Such studies demonstrate that past collections are always operational in the present. Histories of curation remind us that field-based sciences develop through collections and in museums, and especially one could talk about both social anthropology and prehistoric archaeology, which develop within museums. Museum exhibits, however, often provide a glimpse of creations of truth values through displays of associations, which we may see through some of these cases. And I bring to your notice two cases. One is of a Saraikola, as I call it, the Burzo home case in the Harappa Gallery at the National Museum in Delhi. This shows a Neolithic Burzo home. It has a prized object in it, the Saraikola jar, which is from the early Harappan period, found somewhere else, and with carnelian necklaces coming out from it. Now, and the other one is of this case, which is of the Daimabad bronzes, again in the National Museum. Both of them actually fashioned the geopolitics of a Bronze Age civilization called the Indus civilization. Through the Saraikola jar and the carnelian necklace emerging out of it, the Neolithic Burzo home was depicted as part of the Indus civilization as early as 1994, when the Harappa Gallery was created, and when no sure evidence was available for extending the cultural history of this Bronze Age phenomenon to include Kashmir. Daimabad case situates Maharashtra, it's a state in India, within the Indus fold through the late Harappan sighting at the site to which the objects possibly belong. But this is again a tertiary terrain. So such placemaking schemes become archaeological evidence without references to the curatorial efforts. Knowledge production, as we see from these two cases, often occur beyond the field of recovery, and curatorial interventions keep archaeological objects as materially and interpretively emergent outside the disciplinary fold. Okay, again. Okay. The museums of India, as the Archaeological Survey of India's manual tells us, present a marked bias in favor of archaeological material. However, geological, zoological, and natural history specimens made up the earliest museums, which were due to the initiatives of European individuals, often backed by the East India Company. Thus, the Oriental Museum of the Asiatic Society, which provided the nucleus of the subsequent Indian Museum, which is in Calcutta, founded under the Indian Museum Act of 1866, was formally established under the initiatives of a Danish botanist called Nathaniel Wallisch. As a superintendent of the Calcutta Botanical Garden, Wallisch created what is called today as the Consequent Catalogue of over 20,000 plants, which became the first museum catalogue within India and of the Indian Museum, of course. And its history, the history of this cataloging provides a glimpse of the far-reaching connections and exchanges, also of specimens, including from places in Brazil, Argentina, many areas in South America, in fact, through which protocols of classification and identification of collections in India came to be developed. Importantly, the histories of cataloging allow us to note that globalization or expanding of processes and movements across the globe happens when things are affected by relations at an increasingly greater distance from the locality. Minutes of the Conference of Orientalis at Shimla in 1911 tells us that archaeology collections, for which the Indian Museum is best known today, received 36% of the total government subsidy which was allotted to the institution. The zoological section got half, and as Nelson Annandale, the director of the Indian Museum at that time, who was also an entomologist, pointed out, the grants were in direct proportion to the number of specimens and their requirements. The Bharut rail took less handling than a single insect. He also noted that in England, museum research is generally confined to cataloguing and purely descriptive work, since the higher branches of zoological work were carried out in universities. But in India, and I would say that for South Asia, the place for purely scientific zoological research was the museum. Modern science, as its historians have demonstrated by now, emerged in the colonies. And in noting its history, we also note that the curatorial work of research cataloging specimen that went into knowledge making nurtured the contact zones of transnationalism. A good museum, or our concept of a good museum, emulates or we think it should emulate international standards. And collections management protocols represent this aspect. However, in thinking through museums, we also see the building of a legacy of transnationalism by the nationalist politics. Thus, we note that the National Museum at New Delhi was meant to show off India's capabilities of producing a world-class museum. And the appointment of its first director, an American, Grace Smalley, who was formerly the director of the San Francisco Museum of Art, and she had helmed the ICOMOS as a founding member in Paris, it conveys the aspirations of modernity and internationalism of a young nation, although significantly through the curation of pre-modern things. Notably, Morley also encouraged the acquisition of the National Museum's or Indian National Museum's only non-South Asian collection, which is pre-Columbian artifacts, which you see here, the Hiramane collection from Mexico, Peru, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, for a comparative reference for the grand and ancient Indian nation. And I would quote her, as she said, "Hitherto, as in most countries of Asia, Indian archaeological museums, while numerous and possessing rich collections, possessed almost nothing but national. The limitation has been a handicap to Indian scholars, and appraising the importance of their own art in world terms, the collection of pre-Columbian art, now on permanent exhibition at the National Museum, therefore provides an opportunity to rectify this feature." Notably, the Harappa Gallery of the National Museum curates a transnational phenomenon, the Indus civilization, which saddles today as a physical entity between India, Pakistan, and parts of southern Afghanistan. And this gallery also documents the international aspirations of a nationalist archaeology. The negotiated nature of India's foundational collection of the Indus civilization, and for those of you who would not know, this was partitioned between India and Pakistan, and what India has as its foundational collections are objects which it acquired from museums in Pakistan at the time of partition, and which came to India by 1948. So this negotiated nature, the things which are shown are actually halved, and I've written about it, so you can see a couple of my articles on this. This remains well masked within the gallery. The objects from Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and Chanudaro, these are sites in Pakistan today, as well as Nal, Amri, Mundigak. Mundigak is in Afghanistan, Nal and Amri is in Pakistan, which India received in 1948, are not only not displayed as a singular entity that was acquired, they're also not labeled individually with their provenance. We may regard this as a sloppy display and bemoan the standards of curatorship. But perhaps we need to explore this sloppiness as a curatorial act, incorporating the non-Indian Indus objects for showcasing the wealth of India's Harappan collections. Now, very briefly, from 1950, India has been excavating Harappan sites, and the objects from the Indian sites are actually placed with this foundational collection. And as I said, the labels don't tell us which is which. So the placing of objects from Dholavira and Rakhigarhi, which are sites in India, next to those from Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, showcases bounty. And the lack of provenance information in the gallery appears more glaring today in the increasing milieu of the muscular calls of repatriation from India. The avowed disinclination to furnish the displays with object labels and text panels from 1994, when the gallery was established, to this day, may strike a visitor as a ploy to nationing a set of antiquities which were received, thanks to the partition, from a foreign soil. The Harappa Gallery displays the Harappan type through cases of terracotta figurines, terracotta animals, seals, ornaments, vessels, gamesmen, implements, weights, etc. The focus here is on characteristics and salient features, which create visual histories of essentialism. Such displays divert attention from the possibilities that the objects within the same type may have been used and regarded differently during the Bronze Age and thereafter. Typologies conflate distinct domains of identity, and thereby they nurture exclusion. A display of artifact types provides a vision of timeless lien rather similar to the nationalist vision upon both chronology and space. Although the type exhibition fosters a scopic regime of knowability, many Indus objects remain unknown. In this respect, the nationalization of the dancing girl, which is also an Indus object, shows quite glaringly the pliability inherent in methods of fixing meaning. This tiny figure has begun to appear in plethora of forms from around 2016 at a time of its emergent representational value for India as the goddess Parvati, and also claims that were made upon it in Pakistan as representing the Mona Lisa of the country. The increasing visibility of this antiquity in markets as souvenirs today may remind us of its remarkable absence or invisibility as a commodity of consumption for much of the 20th century. Notably, the National Museum of India made in-house models of the priest king, which remained in custody of Pakistan, and not the dancing girl, which India had acquired in 1948. The rampant souveniring of the dancing girl draws us to ask questions about what gets prioritized, researched, and represented by whom, how, and why. These questions invariably are responses to social anxieties about the crisis of representation, and they inflect demands of repatriation. The dancing girl is ascertained as an Indian object through the labeling, and it's here, which you can't probably read it very clearly, but it's the last slide. It's the last slide on the top left-hand corner towards the right, which says that the jewelry and attire resemble ancient life of Harappans, which is still continued in western parts of India. The object label constitutes the act of doing ethnoarchaeology and establishes, albeit crudely, the truth of seeing the Indian Indus civilization displayed in the Harappa gallery. In regarding the display of the nude bronze and in its attired state as a mascot of Bharat, which you see, she's been painted pink in the World G20, which was held in India, we could remind ourselves of Christina Rigg's quip about the displays of the unwrapped Egyptian statues in the museums of the world. If wrapping both created and concealed the sacred in ancient Egypt, what are the implications of placing on public view that which has been revealed, is what she asks, and in some sense destroyed. In this instance, we can play with the trope of wrapping the dancing girl ostensibly to reveal what its nudity masks. The muscular repatriation of the 21st century, the muscular nationalism of the 21st century makes repatriation an urgent cultural policy. And the Yogini Vishnanana, which was brought back with such fanfare to India in 2013, highlights issues of the curation of repatriated things. In her presence at the National Museum, the Yogini embodies the long and heinous practice of looting antiquities. But as an exhibit, in the National Museum, she draws attention to a problematic upkeep of a repatriated object. This sculpture could have been returned to its ruined temple, placed among its spear, and which are 9 other yoginis, and the temple protected. And the reason I say it, I've written on it, is because the studies of yogini has been really thwarted because of the looting, and each of these sculptures are studied in isolation. So the best way of actually studying the practices of the yogini cult in the 11th century is to see them all in situ and study them with their associated others. In seeing this sculpture in the National Museum, we also see that collecting in one place means removing from another. Now, the Tara, I'm sure all of you are familiar with. This is a nationalist imperatives to exhibit meaningful engagements with the international is best noted today within the curation of projects of repatriation. And in this respect, we also note that museums of Sri Lanka exhibit the dire colonial rooting rather clearly. And the country is possibly one of the first in South Asia to have submitted a formal inventory of its loot and a request for repatriation. An academic study of some of the, we go back again. An academic study of the life histories of some of the looted objects that have been successfully rescued back for the country demonstrates their global wanderings. It was a job tracing what came from where, says Alicia Schricker. But the grand exhibition of the repatriated objects with embedded histories of transnationalism possibly, and I say possibly, also presents a flaw in curatorial responsibility. Since if you look at the object label, we do not see that the object labels indicate a change of custodianship. So somebody who has no idea of this history of repatriation elsewhere in the West would think that these objects were on loan in the Sri Lankan Museum from the Rijksmuseum. The curation of repatriation brings us to note some of the anthropology museums, especially those in universities. They have notable histories of colonial collecting and seem to have taken lead in reorganizing their displays to move towards a more ethical curatorial practice. For example, since the 1990s, both MAA and Pitt Rivers in Oxford have pushed for collaborative projects with source communities to involve them in curatorial practices and rectify the colonialist and racist displays. Moreover, responsible collections management practices now increasingly mean displaying efforts of decolonization through text panels. And museums are increasingly investing in designing relational databases that can be shared with communities in distant lands for inputting and changing information. Such databases make visible the participatory aspects of digital networks in engendering new cultural codes of place, secrecy, information, and knowledge. And hence, these databases hold saliency as cultural objects themselves. However, they also draw attention to the fact that technologies function because of social interactions. Now, the curation of repatriation illuminates heritage making, showing this to be a specialist enterprise. Heritage constitutes what we do, privileges expert values, and it now appears well codified in a bewildering range of schemes of management and conservation. Moreover, global processes of ethnic assertion and redefinition, changing ideas about the nature of democratic pluralism, and the intensifying struggle over anything defined as cultural property now converge upon notions, identities, and our constructs of heritage. The booming heritage industry, which seeks the mushrooming of museums for a nation, cajoles us to ask, how long does the psyche of decolonization affect the psyche of the nationalist politics of a decolonized nation? And considering that decolonization has historically represented moves towards moral justice in seeking political solidarity against imperialism, one may expect that inquiries into the forms of its manifestations would enable sharper interrogations of the imperialisms of nationalism and the inequities they thrive upon. One of the pedagogical values of sifting through the politics of decolonization is the critical regard towards ontology, to endowments of materiality, to an absent past. And I bring this talk to an end by showing you, by talking about the trope of transnationalism within the ultra-nationalist politics of museums in India. The view is of a museum at Vadnagar. It's supposedly the hometown of our Prime Minister, which is being built to showcase the city's uninterrupted, majestic history for more than 2,500 years. The city is also being excavated to bring out the continuous chronological history of it from the Buddhist times to the present. We are told that this museum, which you see, is based upon the Acropolis Museum in Athens, this is the Acropolis Museum. This museum overlooks the ruins of ancient Vadnagar, and if you see some of the websites of it, you would actually kind of see a grand architectural design which has been envisioned for it. What it does look over are the city walls, and you can see the archaeological excavation, which is on that blue wrapping. These are being protected from the rains. And the museum will house and display all the antiquities that have been collected from the intense excavations and explorations of the city in the past year from 2023 to 2024. Undoubtedly, the theme that is used by its creators to link it with the Acropolis Museum is the heroic India's repatriation and safeguarding of an innate national heritage. The building, as we may gauge, is a monstrosity in concrete, planted in a place which an eminent architect aptly remarked will also not have any visitor numbers. We can estimate its dilapidation within 30 years, and its ruins would simply add to the destruction of habitats which such grand internationalist national schemes are increasingly perpetuating in South Asia. I would stop here because I think I've just kind of gone over my 30 minutes and take it up from there.
Thank you, Professor Guha. That was a very enlightening and gave us a lot of food for thought, particularly in our context and in the global context as well. Maybe to start us off with, I think one of the interesting points at the very beginning you brought up was this idea of museums as a contact zone, where different cultures come into contact and, as you said, conflict, where these competing dialogues are also heard. I think it's also an interesting comparison to this idea of fieldwork, that you're doing fieldwork outside, and then there's this third space that's like a contact zone. Could this be like seen as one way of engaging with minorities who are still not represented in the museum today? Or also that could be a position that minorities say they don't want to be represented in traditional ways in the museum because of its problematic ways. Is that something that you've seen in different contexts in some of your examples or experiences through anthropology and the representation of it in museums? You're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry. Yes, of course, and I've written on it. So I didn't talk about it because I would be, extending my time period. But yes, the museum as a contact zone, as we all know from Clifford's work, he picked up on the work of Mary Louise Pratt as contact zone, and she had written it. She's from literature. So as you saw from his, it was the indigenous people who did not want to talk about the past or the representation of the object in the past. The museum, and therefore, but with conversation which they had, none of it, which was consensual, were at least they could hold a conversation. So in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, I think it was one of the first museums in 1899, so it would be 1999, when it held its first an exhibition called the Torres Strait Islanders, where for the first time the island communities of the Torres Straits, they came into the museum to actually show the curators how to display their collection. It's a long history. Have a look. There's a lot of material on it. This is Alfred Haddon going to the Torres Straits and collecting most of their stuff. So much of the stuff is, and then the place was. They actually went. They became Christians because of the proselytizing activity. So much of the material, the ancestral materials, are actually held in the museum in the West, and especially in Cambridge. So one of the ways in which this happened was to get them over. But the whole in India, and I've actually talked about the Indian situation. We have a tribal museum, which is a very beautiful tribal museum, which has come up in Bihar, and there you see, and some of the labels kind of mentioning that this is from a tribal folklore. But the museum's label doesn't make it very clear that they've had any consensual talks with the tribals. So the tribals are still presented as a collectivity, not in an individual representation, which actually still then what does it do? It keeps a distinction between the tribals and the us, because when it comes to us, the non-tribals, material representation, for example, in art, we would be shown our authorship is given. Their authorship becomes a collective responsibility. And the contact zone is actually what, but it's not only the museums. Archaeologists fail to realize that the field itself is a contact zone. But because archaeologists are such hierarchical people, they always go there as, the archaeologists will go and say, we are the professional people and we are taking information from the locals. So what museum studies has offered is actually to show us quite glaringly the hierarchy which is involved in knowledge making. And that is what a place like this allows us to interrogate. So that's what it is. And there are many examples I can give you, but I guess you could also read up on this.
Thanks. Maybe towards the end, we can share some of the links with those who are interested. I can look at that. One more idea I want to bring up before we open it up is, I think Alice Stevenson and also the history of museums looks at how museums have been historically integral to the formation of academic disciplines. And also, like, as the natural sciences have their laboratories, museums have also served as these spaces or laboratories for the social sciences. And also how museums themselves have been crucial in terms of disciplinary thinkings. I mean, you also didn't mention it, like classification, sorting, exhibition, and curation. And I was trying to draw a link between that history and also provenance research, because now, particularly in Sri Lanka, I don't know in the situation in India, there's a lot of prominence given to art historian and art historical evidence to claim provenance, because repatriation claims are very much based on being able to prove that they are from this period or being stolen. So, is there any connections that perhaps provenance research can build on or even look into these claims?
See, these are two different questions because the first thing is about natural sciences, as for example, the work of somebody called Kapil Raj will tell you, much of the natural sciences have also, many of them have actually developed from the museums. And if you think in terms of anatomy, for example, you take a corpse and you start cutting it, and these are through collections that these disciplines have developed, right? Egyptology is a classic example of this as well. So the museum, what the problem, I think, in terms of kind of specifying discipline, is that archaeology still remains a positivist science, not in the West anymore, but very much so in South Asia. Archaeologists very rarely think in terms of museums. For them, museums are pedagogical, of pedagogical value. They would take students to the museums and they say, well, this happened then, this happened then, this is what you see there. You cannot make them understand that field research can be done within that. And especially if you do so, i.e., you start going to the bags of archaeological material which is stored in many of these museums through stratigraphy, through their trench number, through their location, etc., you might actually come up with a very different interpretation of an archaeological phenomenon which has been passed through fieldwork. It's happened in many cases, and I've also shown it in some of my work. So that's a different ball game. The other thing which is happening in the world, I mean, and you would know it from Sri Lanka, I would know it from India, many places you cannot do field work any longer. The Indus civilization, for example, poses a huge problem. You cannot do field work in South Afghanistan any longer, or many areas of the world. So then museums should become the spaces for actually doing field research. That is what comes out from archaeology. That is what has also come out from anthropology. In terms of the distinction between art and anthropology, many artists are now asked, I mean, museums are, especially the anthropological museums, are acquiring art. For example, the MA in Cambridge has got many collections, new collections from the places where this museum's collections come from. So they would be from the Pacific, for example, Vanuatu, Torres Straits, Papua New Guinea. These young artists today are asked to come and relate to the collection and create new artwork so that the old collections are brought alive and they start engaging with something which is happening now. Collections don't kind of sit back and you forget all about them or you think about them in the past. Such kinds of work is not happening in South Asia. At least I do not see that in India. Even when, I mean, places like CSMVS, which is perhaps the only museum in India, which is very quite forefront in terms of thinking about collections practices, etc., it's very rare. And when that happens, the artwork is placed completely separate from the collections histories from which it has been inspired. Provenance research has got two different coins. And I say it because I had applied for something for doing provenance research recently. And one of the questions which came up there was, and mind you, this collection is in the UK. So one of the questions, and it was expected, is that if these are all ours, we want them back. Why do you want to do provenance research for something which is in the UK? I think it's a completely mindless, unintellectual, uninsightful question, because many museums in the West and in the East and in the North and in the South, wherever they are, we need to do provenance research for the collections themselves. We need to know where they've come from. But more than we need to know, what the repatriation, for example, this weapons of persuasion shows us, is that despite wherever they may have been made, these objects have accrued many different kinds of histories. They've gone from many places. And I would suspect it would happen for many. So if I show you, I mean, maybe I can show you one thing here. And these are the last two screens. Just showing you what what I saw very recently in Dresden. I mean, if we can kind of think in terms of writing text panels, which are so, I hope you can see this. And what you see here is,
No.
you can see
Yeah.
this. This is actually what you can see. It's a Mughal court. This was made in the 18th century by a goldsmith in the Dresden Palace called John Dinglinger. Ebba Koch has written largely on it. It's Aurangzeb who's seated, and he's being bowed to. It's a potpourri of everything from Chinese. It was what the Orient was conceived as. And here you see an Oriental man, and you see that the fanciful Oriental clothing, etc. So you have labels and text panels here, which are kind of much more than just provenance. This also gives you a glimpse of the weird historiographies or the imperialisms of colonialism, which has happened here. And the other one here is, this is the National Museum in Prague, where I was, and you can see how they begin, which says, we will never know all the details and layers of the past. However, keeping in mind that no one can be deprived of the right to their own history, we introduce you to the story of the Czech lands. Now, both of them and Czechoslovakian lands are problematic lands. So here you see that they have these text panels, and we all know the constraints of it. Text panels cannot have thousands of words, as the National Museum in Delhi has in the Harappa Gallery. Literally, the first text panel is of 1,000 words, and I've counted them. Text panels can only have 150 words at the maximum, which is a transnational museum practice. But within that, I think you can tell people about the complexity of provenance research as well. Provenance research is not simple, and these are the complexities of history. So what I would draw attention to in thinking through collections management practices, as I have drawn attention to my other work, and I think one of my books, which I'm very fond of, is Artifacts of History, which I published before this objects volume, is that history is complex. And the histories, and objects allow us to move in and through this complexity, and people are not stupid. So you can actually give them that complex history very clearly within the word limits of a text panel. So maybe that's the way to do provenance research. And all of us need to do provenance research. So I will not name the museum for which they do it, but they are coming up with a major public rehang in 2027. And they're very aware that many of their objects are like, it just says a temple in Madurai. Now, the object may have come. Which temple, we do not know. So they really wanted to do a provenance research with Indian colleagues, but that was just literally shot down by the country saying we would want these things back. Now, repatriation, as I said, I use the word muscular repatriation because anthropologists would tell you, and I would tell you, having worked with photographs, that museums have always repatriated. For example, in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, we have done that by taking photographs of the objects back to the indigenous communities, and there has been ceremonies where they have kind of put it in their heads and they've gone through it. And the problem comes, it's only when you cannot, and loans, for example, if you have major exhibitions and you give loans of an object for a certain time, the problem comes when you put an object as an AA category, as they do in India, which means the object cannot get out. So, or your insurance is very difficult because it's something is valueless. So there are other problems, but these are all actually problems which are associated with collections management practices. So we need to look at that carefully.
Thanks. Maybe just to also highlight this word muscular, like repatriation, and also how it's being probably used by nationalists for purposes. Is there a particular history to this use of the term muscular repatriation? And
no, I use it because just like I use the word decolonization, I've started using the word colonization there with what is happening in terms of the architectural spaces which have been taken away and it's been used by a certain community or a certain political party for doing what it wants to do. And I can say that for India, I cannot say it for other countries. I after all work in India and I'm from there. But for example, for India, for example, we won the Kohinoor. And we've had very senior people saying we won the Kohinoor. Now, the Kohinoor, which exists today in the what's it called, the London Bridge, the museum in the London Bridge, is not the Kohinoor we went out of the country. It has been since then. It has been chipped off. It has been put in different kinds of jewelry. So the point is, I mean, what are you asking for? Every question of repatriation, and of course, I mean, there's been serious loot from South Asia. We cannot condone the colonial loot. There's been serious loot, but every object, every claim for repatriation is a different claim, is a new claim, has to be made on a very informed basis. What would the country do with that repatriated object back? Sometimes, for example, a country doesn't want certain kinds of object because it's doing some other kind of nationalism. We are doing Hindu nationalism in our country. We don't want, we really couldn't care less about if we wanted some Christian stuff back or Muslim stuff back. And I would say that publicly. But so it just depends. I mean, there is a politics behind repatriation as well. So we need to be aware of that. We need to be informed about that.
In my last question before I open it up to the others in the group is also the idea. I think I really like the idea of the souvenirs and how that's also a new form of heritage making. And also, I think looking at Stevenson's work on the history of reproductions and how with foreign exhibitions, how reproductions themselves give value to the actual object that's somewhere either in the field or in a museum. Would you like to maybe talk a bit about that, how these casts, and I think I've seen some in the Columbia Museum as well, and the histories of that, how they've gone to Japan, how they've gone, maybe they're not very realistic looking replicas, but how these give new meanings to particular exhibitions within the nation and the nationalistic.
I think I was very struck and I was very happy to see in Sri Lanka that cast of Tara, the gilt cast of Tara. And in the Kandy Museum, I saw a banner, and they said that the original is in Scotland. It's in, I think it's at Glasgow. I forget, but we couldn't take a picture.
Museum, yeah.
Yeah. So I couldn't take a picture because they said you cannot take pictures. But I had never seen anything like this in India. Okay. But the point is that at least it makes somebody aware that, look, there was, and it's not only this cast of Tara, there's something else also in, I forget now, the National Museum, in the same area, same section of a big, I have a picture of it, I mean, of a Buddha, which is missing from there. And they said that so-and-so took it out. So when you make, and I have worked on, the cast of the Sanchi Stupa, the Eastern Torana of the Sanchi Stupa is there in my book. The person who's actually worked on it was Professor Kavita Singh, who unfortunately we lost. She passed away a year back, but it is, and I've just seen the cast in Berlin, in Humboldt. So the point, what with casts, souvenirs, what archaeologists called fake. I mean, so archaeology is, again, like artistry, makes a distinction between the original and the copy. And the original is valued and the copy is not. But if you work with photographs, you realize that you can make 5 copies of the same print, I mean, of something, of the same image from a negative. If, for example, if it was my copy of my childhood baby picture, within my family, it would be all about, oh, wow, this is a baby picture. If this copy was shown in some exhibition out about the races of India, I would be a type. If this copy then is shown in a textile museum somewhere, I would be a type of the kind of attire I'm wearing, right? So objects, same object, would make different meanings in different context of viewing. And therefore, we should not throw away the cast, because in many a times, for example, a copy, especially in archaeology, when we think in terms of the Ajanta caves, is the copy of those paintings of these Ajanta caves actually allows us to see the caves better than what we would see in real life. And a copy, for example, of the dancing girl, a souvenir acquires value when we put in the past history into something new. So it tells us about past making. Histories are not out there for us to grasp. Histories are how we create them, what we grasp out of that past, how we endow historicity. So copies, the life histories of the copies actually tell us a lot about certain aspects of history which starts circulating or proliferating at a certain time in the present. And I think that tells you a lot about the politics of the present. And representation, as we all know, is not something blind. It's not, again, something innate, because representation itself is recreation all the time. And Alice Stevenson's work, I think it's really, really good, is because it is about the scattered finds. Archaeological finds somebody bags something and takes to the person's university. Somebody bags something and takes to the other person's university. So these finds get scattered all over. And then the directors, they sit back together and they try to piece it together. But if you don't go and look at the ways in which some of these have been classified elsewhere, stored elsewhere, bagged elsewhere, conserved elsewhere, you lose out on a huge amount of history. And I don't want to kind of denigrate any of this thing, but there is a huge amount of prehistoric India which I think is missing because they haven't bothered to do this. So that's the exciting bit about these scattered finds. But the copies, I'm not the only one. I mean, so there was a cast court in the V&A which has got destroyed. But yeah, I mean, I think as an archaeologist, I'm very, very interested in thinking through the copies, because I realize that my kiln, they just say, oh, it's just a fake. It's not.
I think that's the same kind of attitude I see in Sri Lanka and in the museums as well. So I think it's something for us also in the cultural and heritage sector, and to think about these in new ways, and also how photographs themselves have documented where they have been displayed and in what context.
Yeah, and photographs always pick up additional excess information. So even if you hold your camera and you try to take something, a twig would just somehow come into your picture frame, which you haven't realized. So this excess of information, and somebody who's worked on it really, really carefully has been Crispini. And I'm sure you all know his work, Elizabeth Edwards. I mean, these people have been my mentors. So again, it's the same thing with, when we talk in terms of historians in India, archaeologists in India, they don't seem to understand that these histories are important. They don't seem to kind of channel their work through that. And they're all doing heritage. They're all doing heritage studies with the premise that heritage exists in the ground, not with the premise that heritage is what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Something doesn't say, I'm heritage, look at me. Heritage is actually what we do at a site.
Absolutely. I think we have a question. Buddhisha, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you, Han. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, and thank you, Professor Guha, for your inspiring and wonderful presentation. So I have two questions. Actually, they are interconnected. So while we have done a lot of research inside of the museums, I'm concerned that we are not fully respecting the sacred value of the objects on display. So many of these objects like relics, cascades, statues, and some paintings hold deep spiritual meanings, spiritual significance. And according to my opinion, I think it is a problem to put things with such sacred values in museum galleries. So do you think we are doing enough to acknowledge and preserve the cultural and spiritual significance of these objects? And my second question is, do you think that replacing authentic objects with replicas will solve this problem? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Okay, so I do not know what Sri Lanka is doing. I can tell you India is doing nothing. But having worked in an anthropology museum outside, when you get source communities to talk about the objects, and I still remember there were Sami people who came in and they looked at me and they said, why is this gong of a bell and the bell displayed both together? Why have you done it? It's going to take our secrets away. Either you put the bell into the storage or you put the gong into the storage. Okay. So in the colonialist context, what had been people's secrets, what had been their sacred objects were looted. They were taken away. They were displayed irrespective, with no regard of the histories which these objects carried, of the value, more than the history, I would say, of the value these objects may have had, personal, spiritual, whatever they are. Because they are, after all, they have been taken out of context and they have been placed somewhere else. Now, if there is a history of doing so, either you can see there are two ways of looking at it. That when you next make a museum and you decide to put certain things into it, you take due cognizance of what the community from where you've taken these objects think about it. And you exhibit them according to that. But if you're talking about a historical museum, which has already been existing, and I can say, for example, the Indian Museum in Kolkata, I don't want to talk about Sri Lanka because I really don't know very much. I've just been there as a visitor in February. So there are certain things which are there. So then you can have a text panel at least explaining that this thing was brought out from there. And perhaps if they still have, which they do in many indigenous communities, especially, for example, and I would say that with the tribal museums, for example, in Bhopal, that there are certain things which are considered absolutely secret. It's the secrecy and the sacredness which goes with it. And if the community still thinks that they have the potency or these objects have the power, despite the fact that they have been exhibited for hundreds of years out there, then they should be listened to. So there has to be a dialogue with the what should I say? But those whose ancestral property these objects are. And that is also one of the things of museums being a contact space. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Professor, thank you.
Okay, we have one more question from Nadira Rajapaksha.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much, Professor Guha, for this presentation. And my question is about the comment you made, at the beginning when you said it's the material objects that give us all our interpretation and reading of the immaterial. And on that, I was just wondering, because I'm not at all a specialist in museum studies or archaeology. My question is about how, in a simple way, what recommendations would you give us to make sure that the interpretations or the readings we have of these material objects are not biased, or how can we make it as accurate as possible, as inclusive as possible? Or, this question is for the general public as well, but also maybe for curators as such. That is, what are the methods that we can use to make sure that the readings we have or the interpretations we have are as, if I can use the word accurate, I don't know if that's the correct word, but as accurate or as close as I'm maybe diverse also, because readings can be multiple. So sorry if it's
No, that's fine. Is that it?
Yes, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So what I meant when I said the immaterial is shown through the material is, think about, okay, I mean, maybe you can't think about it, but I can think about Hinduism. So religion is immaterial, right? You don't see God, you don't see anything. But the ways in which you approach religion, or what if I did not do all the rituals of the religion are material stuff. I pour water into something, I put ghee into something. So I'm actually, if you go to a place like Banaras, I mean, you'd actually see that, the immateriality of religion is shown. We accept the fact that religion is out there, etc., through the material stuff. That's all I meant. Now, objects are material. I mean, objects are things. Let's just use the word things here. And things carry many stories. Things can be everything. Things can be you, me, we are all things or whatever. We have many stories. The challenge is actually to be able to convey all the credible stories. I'm not just saying, let's just do what was he called? Daniken or whatever, who had spacecrafts who came from Van Daniken. I forget. Anyway, I was asked this question once and I just said, therefore I said that there are credible stories. An object history tells you many stories about an object. And what I find more and more, especially because I work with antiquities, is that for many of the antiquities, we actually don't know what they were used for, what they meant. The dancing girl, I have no idea what she represented in her time. So sometimes we do not really know, to use your word, the accurate history of the objects, or we may not have an accurate description. We can describe an object as saying this is bronze, this is 11 centimeters tall, this is etc., but we wouldn't really know what it had meant for. But they do accrue histories, they do accrue stories. So I think our responsibilities are to be able to tell them all, whichever way. And that is the way in which you keep the multiple voices, if one has to use the word. I mean, I know these sound very, very cliched, but if you have to keep the multiplicity, the multiple voices, which are sometimes they gather around an object, if you have to convey that, that's the way to do it. It actually makes museum work a very difficult work. And what I want to trash here is that museums are not only of what we see as pedagogical value, where the curator does something and it's a top-down. So people come in and they say, oh, this is this, this is this. They should be the place where also you allow visitors to come and say, oh, well, this could be this, and be able to leave that trace of what the person thinks in some form or the other somewhere. There are outreach sheets. There are many ways of doing it. And I know I'm digressing, but all I want to say is that the immaterial is always made material. I mean, think about religion. That's actually what I've done. And I've written on it in an article on Banaras to a large extent. And I say this because archaeology also does it, field work. I mean, we how the past, which is absent, is actually shown through the material. I mean, that's the ontology bit. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you very much. And I'd be very interested in reading the article also.
Okay.
Eventually. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks. I think, Anisha, would you like to maybe respond? I think, Sudeshna, you were talking about how object histories have many stories, and also that museum work is really hard. So I think maybe she could also talk a bit about this recaptioning process that we're also working towards. Anisha, are you?
Yeah, actually, you touched on it. It's very interesting to me that in your presentation, you talked about how the Colombo National Museum's labels don't really give an indication of the history beyond, that they were in the Rijksmuseum collection, that the collection, it has been repatriated and isn't just unknown. And so, I thought I could just talk a little bit about this project that we're doing, also part of this Dutch repatriation project that we have got funding for, which is we're doing a virtual exhibit of these 6 objects that were repatriated. And as part of that, we are recaptioning them. So the whole purpose of the virtual exhibit isn't just to say, okay, here are 6 objects that were returned, but to take a very specific look at these objects as a way of looking at repatriation as a whole and this idea. And so we're recaptioning each of the objects to either kind of trace the journey that they've taken and touch on various, thoughts that people have had about those, theories that people had about those objects in previous captions or previous records of those objects, and what the provenance research has shown about those objects, or to kind of talk about how provenance research works a little bit, and to say, to show like what kind of limitations it can have. So really to look at this idea of repatriation and the return of these objects through and using those objects as like a way to look at that. And I know that's just one way of looking at the objects. Obviously, there's a million different ways to look at the objects. But part of the project is to kind of show that there are different ways.
That's fantastic, because the point is, I don't think there is a collective like yours in India, and you are young people who are doing it. So that's why I can actually try to foil it with that Yogi Vrishnanana. And I say it today because I think as we speak, I think Glasgow Museum is giving 16 paintings to India, right? I mean, every day something or the other is going back. And then also, of course, every day you also see, for example, in Cambodia, I mean, you see the Metropolitan Museum with the stolen objects from Cambodia. I mean, there are some horror stories about looting and repatriation, and they have to be taken very seriously. But just claiming them and saying this is ours is not going to do anything to anything, right? And that is, I mean, and that's why I wanted to put that thing with Vadnagar and the Acropolis Museum, because Greece has been on this for so long about the Parthenon museums the Parthenon marbles. And and right now with what has happened in the British Museum, with some of the Greek antiquities being sold on eBay, I think Greece has a much, much better hold on their history than the UK has. I mean, so the UK has always said that, look, you all cannot you will not be able to keep it. We will keep it. So therefore, they made this Acropolis Museum.
Mhm.
So there are these really, really strong cases for this. But what happens? And that is, I think, in a way, we still use a word called museology, which is a 1950s work or a word or a 1930s word. Now, that was all about curatorship, how to be a good curator. And I see this in India, that they don't understand that the point is that they actually need to lodge these histories in a different way. The fact that you have something on a virtual platform and you're doing it also gives you a kind of a democracy outside the curatorial, a very strong government-controlled curatorial fold of the museum. Because how many people have the power to actually talk about anything? Today, I might be talking about museums, but would they allow me to do anything in the National Museum? No. And I can still say that I was a Tagore scholar there for 2 years, and I had to leave in a year because our government, well, the director changed. Having worked in a national museum in India, trying to do something with cataloging the Harappan collections, I can actually say that what you're doing is important. So that's great. And I don't know, for your collective and consortium, and one of the reasons I thought I would talk about it is, one could think in terms of extending this with, say, Indians and Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan. We all have the same problem. All these museums are actually in that same problem there. And in Lahore, they've had a new exhibition, which they had in 2015 on the Harappan objects. And that's the first time when they decided that they were going to catalog to a research cataloging level all the objects. So that was a start. And though the reason they wanted to have this exhibition was, the idea was that they could tell the local people to take great interest in their Indus heritage. Okay, so the idea is whatever it is. But youngsters, and because the museum professional is growing, perhaps, there is not very much jobs in it. I know it's very poorly paid. In the West, it's a horror story where really you can't, it's really bad, the culture sector. But if it is going to grow, if museums are going to mushroom, then the youngsters have to take cognizance of this. And I think you have to find very different ways of using the technology which is available, using the knowledge which is available, and doing more research within these collections to come up with all the different histories which a collection or an object can tell us. And their museum research is sometimes completely neglected by the curators who have been in museum for a long time. So
yeah. I also have sort of a vague, unrelated question, which is, you talk about the importance of kind of doing this research, and I was wondering, what are the constraints to this kind of research? Because just to give a little context, for my master's thesis, I looked at Sri Lankan masks in Western museums, and how I basically looked at their catalogs, and I analyzed sort of how collecting practices and cataloging practices have affected how those masks are then represented and interpreted within the collections of these museums. And in my research, I found that even the cataloging practice, standard catalog that's used for museums, for anthropological museums, is just replicating these, like you said, the scientific, biological archaeology catalog. And this idea of adding like a culture was not added until like 50 years into the process of collecting and cataloging these artifacts. So do you find that there are a lot of restrictions to the depth of the research you can do because so much information is lost because of these constraints or these past practices?
I think you've touched on a very raw nerve. So what we all find when we work with these scattered collections is that you go into these places and they're day books, as I would call it. These are the annual registers, unlike, say, the National Museum, which doesn't have any day books, or unlike, and I'm saying it because I know it, they don't have any annual, I've seen only the annual registers of the weapons department out there. And the rest is, I've never been able to find out apart from what I found out from the National Archives of India, where exactly are those partition files gone? Because there must have been duplicate sets, which must have been given to the National Museum. The National Museum doesn't have anything, but the National Archives has got some. Now, those are the touchy subject of nation forming. I can understand that they don't exist. But when it comes to recently, I'm thinking of embarking, and as I'm thinking of embarking, because this is a project which I've never had the time to do it, but actually to look at some of the archaeology collections which came into the UK. And then I have a very strong period, 1920s and the 1950s, because that is when Mortimer Wheeler, that is when many archaeologists came and got things. This is not the collection from the 19th century, which India wants back. Alexander Cunningham had taken things from Sanchi Stupa and whatever Stupa, etc. I'm not looking at any of that. I'm actually looking at stone tools. And I'm kind of thinking, even there, there is so much information which is missing. Like, who was the donor? Or they have CG and you don't know who it is. You don't know the date. You don't know what site. Right. So, so each of these things requires you then to go and sit and spend hundreds of years probably in an archive or through archaeology books. So from other ways of figuring out. But at least one begins a collections research, research with histories of collection, because it's histories of collecting practices, I think, would make a very, very significant contribution to histories of, for example, I can say of pre-colonial India, because how those histories have been built up, they have got colonialist historiographies or they've got nationalist historiographies embedded in it. But histories of collection actually allows us to kind of rethink these histories. So yes, I sympathize with your with the travails, because I've faced the same thing. And many a times it's also like, oh, we're doing this and we'll show you these boxes, or like in Cambridge, these have now gone to some D space somewhere else. It'll take 100 years for it to come back, because museums like archives and libraries are now constantly having to fight for spaces. Their collections have gone somewhere else because they are in storage or whatever. So there are constraints, but I think if we start tapping into this, at least we make, you can then, for future curatorial stuff, somebody would remember that, oh, let's just make this day book so that this can have all these information. Let's just think about the information we are going to input in this object when the object is acquired by the museum. When somebody comes and says, hey, I've got 10 hand axes, I don't know from where, will you take it? So, that would be interesting. And I can tell you stories about the Nal pottery, which is from the 3rd millennium BC. It was found in a site called Sohardam in Afghanistan. Nal, it's part of, well, it's not Harappa, but you can study that with the Indus civilization. And there's some beautiful polychrome ware, absolutely beautiful polychrome ware, which the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge has. It comes from some Mrs., and I will not mention her name, but somebody, obviously a colonial officer's wife. But I wish that they'd taken down some more details about her, about how she got it from, etc., instead of saying that these are Nal pottery 32 pots. So, yeah.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
Are there any more questions from anyone here? If not, I have maybe one last question, using this opportunity to ask all my questions. And since you, I think, spoken about your work with photography collections and how they elicit a lot of information about the history of museums and all of that, I also wanted to link it to this idea that's coming up recently about, okay, if former colonies want to access these objects, can digital repatriation be an option? Like, because photography, sometimes you said, gives us more details, gives it more democratic access to places. So what's your opinion on that? Is that one part of repatriation? Is that to what extent do you get information from photographs, and how can Western museums use this as a tool, or is it also a cop-out? If they say you can't look after these objects, at least you can have high resolution photographs.
Look, that's well, photographs have things, that's a different thing from a digital repatriation. A digital repatriation is also when you have these databases, and I showed you one aspect of it. You have these databases which are called relational databases. You create something and you give it to the source community so that they can input information out there, right? You may not want to have all that information placed in your public profile in the museum. You have various levels of databases. Some of them are for the public, some of them are for the community. You can control the data which you give, but at least you can repatriate. I mean, not repatriate, you can actually have these digital platforms, and it's very easy to do so, to have these relational platforms where people can input information. And you have that information, because one of the biggest challenges we have had is the loss of information. And you would know it. Anybody who works with archives, cataloging, in libraries, with collections, you know that every 10 years, museums write the same catalog again because they've lost information. When card catalogs get transformed into a digital thing with the various field stuff, etc., you lose information. So the idea is to get as much information as possible. And I think that is a different thing with digital platforms. Now, the photograph collections, there are two different things. If you cannot have the objects, will photographs do the work? Well, I don't know. It depends upon the situations. But there have been places where there have been photographers have gone. So this was in Ethiopia, which happened. David Buxton, he photographed in the Lalibela in Ethiopia in the 1940s, and there are 200 of his big photographs we have. The church has since then changed its demeanor, whatever. The photographs went back to Ethiopia, right? So somebody made a print, same kind of print, and sent those photographs. So here, the object has gone back. The photograph in itself was the object which has gone back. The other case in Tejpur, which I know, Tejgarh, sorry, which is in Chota Udaipur, it's in Gujarat. There, some of the tribal community, their photographs of some of the people went back, and they could recognize their grandparents and etc., etc. So these are different kinds. But what I say is every repatriation claim and every repatriation project is different. So if something has been photographed and the photographs go back to that community, that's a different way of looking at it. Many things have gone back to Torres Straits like that in terms of booklets, in terms of their material. They have, and I guess it's like, as somebody has written a very poignant article, we get our mother home. So especially the anthropological photographs, which then goes back to the indigenous communities, that is a different kind of repatriation, right? So your grandparents you've never seen or whatever, they are the type photographs which has gone back. So that has happened in a very large way in the US and in Australia. I don't know about India at all, apart from this one example I can give from the Tejgarh Academy, which happened, but that's because it happened with the MAA. So there is a huge scope there. And people, and I know now, because I work on Sikkim, that this is something which they're kind of looking at, looking at the old photograph studios and kind of trying to make those prints and take it to the community. And so there are the Limbus, or the Bhutias or the Lepchas, and kind of saying, well, this probably came from your family. So it doesn't have to be from the west to the east. It also can be within our terrain. And when it comes to at least in India, when it comes to the indigenous terrain, it is the city and them, because we still do this us and them to such an extent that we should not be talking about decolonization at all, because the decolonization is actually of the mind, when you're able to break down the hierarchy of us and them. So it's beyond the nation state, I think. Yeah.
I think that's a great kind of thought to leave us on in terms of decolonizing the mind, because it is a much larger project. I think we also covered a lot of scope, from curation and exhibiting of repatriation to also photography collections and looking at museums as fieldwork. And I think you brought a lot of examples from your own work and your own kind of different versions of also coming into museums from archaeology, from working with museum collections. I think so. This would be also great starting point. I think for us also in Sri Lanka, this is like really interesting stuff, and it's an interesting moment also to be talking about these So I really also take your point in terms of linking up with other South Asian collectives and
Yeah.
heritage workers at this moment.
There are many youngsters in India, for example, who would be very happy to know of your collection. I mean, I have got students, and I say I have students. I mean, I also know youngsters who would be very, very happy to actually, engage with this and think through this, because one has to do it outside the nation in a way. I mean, as I said, for me, the largest thing about a decolonization is, I mean, as human beings, we seem to spread inequality all over. So this at least gives us a way of thinking about the inequities which we breed. And that's a platform to think about. We talk about shared history, we talk about this, that, and the other, but we actually don't do very much about it. So yeah, it links in to a bigger question of humanity. Is what
And
I
finally,
think.
thanks again for accepting our invitation and for sharing your
Thank you.
knowledge. And
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me. It was wonderful meeting you, Johann. I would say that.
Yes.
Because for me, I was just a visitor in Sri Lanka, as you know. And I'm sorry if I said something about the Sri Lankan repatriation or whatever, but remember, I saw this only as a visitor, and it's only now that I have decided that sitting in Cambridge, I read up about it and I talked to people about it, and I got to know Sujit said he was actually there at the opening, and his friend did something about the opening. So it's only now that I've figured out. But somebody saw this picture which I'd sent, and this is somebody in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and she said, "Is this a loan?" And I said, "No, they've got this stuff back." And that is when it struck me that the accession number hadn't been placed in it. So yeah. Okay. Thank you
And
very
thank
much.
you
Thanks,
everyone for
Martin.
joining, and hope to see you at our next events as well. So good evening to all of you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Professor
Thank you.
Guha.
Thank you. I think I'll leave.